have been traveling through Latin America for more than 20 years. I am fortunate to have been to spend time in each and every country on the continent. All the Spanish-speaking ones, the only one I am still missing is Cuba. They never invited me. But many of the English-speaking ones, obviously. I'm quite familiar with the bulk of the continent. I've traveled it, and I keep traveling it regularly. The question that formed in my mind over time, why? Latin America remains poor. Why is Latin America poor? Oh, when the rest or many parts of the planet have taken off, are taking off, are in full development, why in Latin America, despite wanting to and constantly seeking to get on the path to development, it's always the same discourse. We are still obviously very far behind, and we will see it as to insert ourselves on the path to development, if you think about it. In other parts of the world right now, in many parts of the world right now, they talk about the cloud, they talk about the Internet of Things, they talk about drones that go and deliver packages to your house, they talk about self-driving cars, etc. The Internet of Things. Here in Latin America, we continue talking about the price of corn. We keep talking about the price of beans, the price of soybeans, the price of oil. So in many ways, as we are decades behind many parts of the world. So what are we missing? First of all, what I'm going to establish here is not any groundbreaking insight. I'm not here to present something from myself, a personal reflection, a story that says no. It is simply, and what I propose here is to do in Latin America what all developed countries or those that are currently developing have done, because this is the latest news. All developed countries or those on the path to development have all done it the same way, exactly the same. No one has done it differently. Everyone has done it the same way. And all I'm saying here is, let's do exactly what everyone is doing. That's all. Integrating reform. We have to make economic reform, major economic reform. It's very interesting. I'm going to quickly explain how Latin Americans have a lot of experience in making reforms. We have made great economic reforms that explain the situation in which Latin America is right now, which is a very good situation. Many of you are very young. You might not remember. But those who read history and those who are a bit over 40 years old will remember that Latin America during the 20th century was a century of recurring crises. Latin America had cycles of crisis with inflation, inflationary spirals, and crisis again. We would grow for 6, 7 years, and then crisis and crisis and crisis again. So there was a very clear need to do something because these crises were absolutely terrible, and I am talking about Latin America in general. Finally, in the 80s, after a major crisis in Mexico, specifically in '82, which affected the rest of Latin America, Costa Rica experienced a very strong crisis at that time. What I call the first generation of economic reforms on the continent began to be implemented. Those were the reforms that later were pejoratively called and are still pejoratively called neoliberalism. Typically, the states were very bloated. The states of Latin America had all kinds of involvement in the economy. There were even bicycle companies owned by the states, etc. The governments began to shrink, started to privatize, etc. A series of important reforms with the hope of being able to arrive with a key to eliminating the crises that we currently had in our Latin America. Unfortunately, the implementation or poor implementation of these reforms, unfortunately, not only they achieved the desired effect, but on top of that, they were decisive, contributing to the seriousness and severity of the ensuing crises, specifically in Mexico again in 1994 to 95. The tequila effect, which some of you may know or have heard of. And the mother of all crises, Argentina, 1999 to 2000, whose severity cannot be explained without the effect of the first generation of economic reforms. But starting from those great crises we had, tremendous, frightening, horrifying, at the end of the last century and the beginning of this one, is where the second generation of economic reforms takes shape, which, along with the first, explain the moment we are in. What moment are we in? We have been 20 years in Latin America, or 19, the entire 21st century, where we have not had economic crisis anymore. This is historic in the region. We have not had a single economic crisis in more than 20 years. Venezuela is another planet. We don't have inflation in Latin America either. And we achieved this with economic reforms. What reforms were made in the second generation from the start of this century and the end of the last century in Latin America? There were reforms with three fundamental objectives. The whole region adopted them. They were reforms aimed at adopting counter-cyclical fiscal measures. Latin America became sincere and fiscally disciplined. We started saving money during periods of growth so that the states could spend it during times of crisis. Later, we can discuss whether Costa Rica in particular took these kinds of measures or not, but the rest of Latin America did. There were reforms aimed at liberalizing exchange rates, fundamental practically all over Latin America. Exchange rates are free floating currencies. The dollar is bought and sold 100% by supply and demand. A large part of the attacks that we received, which caused those crises, came through an attack on our currencies. The central bank said, you know what, currency, defend yourself, and it has worked spectacularly. And another very important measure, Costa Rica as well, pay attention. In the rest of Latin America, dollar loans were basically discarded too. They started making loans in national currencies. These types of reforms, together with the first one, bring us to this moment, which is a very good historical moment for all of Latin America, as I just mentioned. However, we remain in poverty. We did very well in getting rid of economic crisis, very well in getting rid of inflation, but we lack growth, we lack economic development. We need the third generation of economic reforms, to say the least. That's what the countries in the world are doing. What kind of economic reforms do we need at this point in our Latin America? Economic reforms aimed at 3 points. It's just that all this, once again, all this has already been done by all the countries. 3 elements, 3 economic reforms aimed at 3 fundamental points. First, the full utilization of the workforce. That is very important. I like to give this example. In Latin America, if we think about it, in Latin America, we really do not use our hands. We Latin Americans do not work. It is the land that works. Latin America primarily produces what the land produces. Emiliano Zapata, the Mexican revolutionary, used to say, his revolutionary cry, the land belongs to those who work it. What I say is that in Latin America, it is the land that works. In the way that raw materials produce things for us, we need to use our workforce. We don't utilize it in Latin America. We are very good at using our raw materials, but we don't use our main raw material, which is the Latin American workforce. Look at China, the reforms China implemented. China is a manufacturing power. Germany is a manufacturing power. In Latin America, outside of Mexico, speaking of manufacturing, there is no other country truly dedicated to manufacturing, to putting its people to work. And I'm not even saying that Mexico does it fully efficiently. Reforms aimed at a second objective: accumulation of capital, accumulation of physical capital. With our reforms, we solidified our banking systems. We have a very solid banking system, a very solid financial system in Latin America. There has not been a single bank failure in several decades in Latin America, when previously the crisis and attacks came to us through bank runs. You will remember, we have absolutely solidified that. Notice how well we solidified ourselves with the reforms we were able to implement, so that when the United States and Europe fell to their knees in an economic crisis, in Latin America, basically nothing happened to us. At most, we had a brief recession in some countries, and that was it. Notice the benefit of the economic reforms. So I was saying, accumulate physical capital, our saving capacity, our saving level in our countries is abysmal, it is too small, we need to increase it. We have already solidified the financial systems. That's very good, that's basic. But now we need to diversify them. We needed people to have access, not to banking, which they already do, but access to sophisticated banking products. There is very little banking in Latin America in particular, in general, but of that little banking there is, the vast majority of clients are holders of checking or savings accounts. People in general, in large numbers, do not have access, first of all, to credit. Credit is fundamental for entrepreneurship. How much has been said here today about that? There are no credits. It is almost impossible for an entrepreneur to get a loan, but not only that. There is no access to more sophisticated instruments like stocks or bonds, etc. Again, most of the banking is limited to savings accounts and taking accounts, and that does not help the development of a country. And a third element of the reforms that we are trying to promote, that we should promote, is to increase productivity. Latin Americans are tremendously unproductive. And here, a lot has to do with higher education, productivity, higher education. Our higher education worldwide is of very low quality. We have very good universities, but they do not compete internationally on a global level. It is no coincidence that if you go to the United States, and this is real, and I'm sure many of you have been to the United States, to the university, to any of the universities you go to in the United States. I am a large component of the student population of any university, with the United States still being the leading head in terms of intellect, remains the center of education excellence in the world, meaning it is still the United States. And a large component of the students at universities in the United States are students from India and China, and only a small fraction are Latin Americans, a very small fraction. Why? Because students from India and China graduate from high school ready to access the best education in the world, which is that of the United States. Here in Latin America, someone who studies at the best private school in Latin America still has very few opportunities to enter a university in the United States due to their grades and scores. So until we start to solve that issue, we will not be able to match with the world or compete with the world as it is competing right now. I was saying productivity has a lot to do with higher education. I was saying that we Latin Americans use our raw materials a lot. We do not use labor. We do not use our hands as raw material, but we also do not use the most abundant and limited raw material we have as Latin Americans, which is the brain. We do not innovate, we do not invent, we do not create. How many Steve Jobs, how many Bill Gates have been born in Latin America and have not been able to develop because they are not in the right environment? I'm sure many. And I will conclude by saying, this is unfortunately not a propositional talk, since I do not see, and I ask you if you see it, the moment I do not see Latin America close to thinking about or executing these type of reforms. I still do not see Latin America on a clear path. That is why it's called the sleeping continent. We are still asleep, while the rest of the world is quite awake. We are not yet. The problem we have is this. These kinds of things I am saying are discussed and have been repeatedly discussed in presidential houses. I believe the presidents sitting there have a very clear understanding. The presidents of the countries speak in these terms that I am talking about, the presidents of Latin American countries. The problem has always been when it comes to making the policy, when it comes to negotiating it, when it comes to doing it with Congress. And the reality of things is that our history, these reforms that we have made them with our hands on our necks. We have done them in times of terrible crisis. What we have not managed is to make progress in times of peace, so to speak. And that's where the political class has failed us. And I see what's happening with much pessimism. In Latin America, we have tried everything. We have tried democracy. We have tried dictatorship. We have tried left. We have tried right, populism. And we are basically in the same place as always. Thank you very much.